Welcome to the Salon. On this episode, top chef Gail Simmons joins the panel to discuss the rise of Elena Kagan, how to talk about Israel after the flotilla raid, summer wedding season, and more. It's coming up on the Salon.
Hello, I'm Jane Eisner, editor of The Forward and Forward.com.
And I'm Rachel Sklar from Mediaite.com, and this is the Salon.
Rachel, we have some wonderful women joining us today. First, I'd like to introduce Gail Simmons. She is a judge on Bravo's Top Chef, and she has just been chosen as reality TV's #1 judge, and you can imagine the competition for that. Next is Cory Kahaney. She is of Last Comic Standing and has an upcoming show, The Future Mahjong Players of Majestic Isles, which will be touring the country later this year. And we welcome also Lilit Marcus. She is editor-in-chief of thegloss.com. So we've got a lot to talk about today. I thought we'd start with certainly a very big story all around, but especially for Jewish women, and that is the nomination of Elena Kagan to be on the Supreme Court of the United States.
I love her. I unabashedly love her.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. Apparently, the Jerusalem Post does too, because she was named to be in the list of the 50 most influential Jews. One of only 7 women on the list, and one of the others is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, obviously also on our Supreme Court, and Dorit Benish, who is the president of Israel's Supreme Court. Is this going to be the new role model for Jewish women to want to be on the Supreme Court?
I think it'll be your goal in life if you want the Jerusalem Post to like you. I think the fact that there are only 7 women on this list in the first place and that 3 of them are from the judicial system shows a lot more about the people who made the list than it does about the people who are on it. I think there were a lot of fantastic women who have made important contributions to Jewish society who were left off the list in favor of more esoteric men who don't necessarily need a spot on the list that they have every year. So I'm actually much more interested in what it says about the Jerusalem Post and their decisions than I am about the women who are on it.
It's not an entirely uncommon phenomenon to have a list dominated by men. I'm just saying.
Well, there are even judicial women that I think they missed. Judge Judy was certainly, I think, an influence on my life, you know. And she's a judge and a Jew and a woman. She never gets a fair shake.
So what do you think about the shake that Elena Kagan's gotten in the media? There's been all this focus on her background, on her sexuality, on when she had her bat mitzvah. Is it fair game? What do you think, Gail?
I do. I think she is an interesting role model, and I think that it's been interesting to watch how the media here and in Israel have taken to her or not. I feel like the media is always going to focus on those little things that in the course of her life probably weren't necessarily turning points for her or weren't necessarily what she would list on her resume as her 10 most accomplished moments, but that, you know, turn a bit of intrigue and give a bit of juice and perhaps give a little insight into the kind of woman she's going to be in this new role. So the idea of her bat mitzvah being so controversial that she, you know, fought to have a bat mitzvah at a synagogue that was an Orthodox synagogue and would not have otherwise granted her a bat mitzvah because it didn't grant any women bat mitzvahs, all of a sudden becomes much more significant once we discover that she goes on to become a Supreme Court justice.
But it's an indicia of character. Like what I loved about that story is how she was, you know, this brainy kid who looked at a rite of passage and didn't understand why it wasn't available to her and sort of like, you know, forced it to happen and took it seriously. And I don't know, I mean, maybe it's like the nerdy kid in me that identifies with that, but I just love that, and I see that as being sort of an indicator of her being very principled, and you see echoes of that in the stand she took when she was at Harvard on, you know, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell stuff. I don't know, like I said, I sort of love her.
I think you're right. I think also, if it wasn't for people like Elena Kagan, I wouldn't have had a bat mitzvah, right? Yeah. So all of those things add up to a certain character that women, I think, Jewish women need to be thankful that they are around us.
And I think that it may seem insignificant and it may be something that she doesn't register as the most important moment in her life, but it gives you a sense of the kind of person she is and how she might rule on decisions that are coming up in the future. I think anybody who comes from a background where they were in any way marginalized and has now come into a position of authority is going to be so much more empathetic to other people who are in similar predicaments.
But here's the curious thing about it all, which is, on the one hand, it seems if she were if she's going to be accepted to the Supreme Court, that'll be 2 of the 9 justices being Jewish women in these tremendous leadership roles. And yet in the Jewish community, women are so absent in leadership roles. We just learned recently that finally, of the 20 largest Jewish federations in North America, there is finally now the first ever woman appointed to head them, Jennifer Gorovitz in San Francisco. So until now, there were literally more Jewish women on the Supreme Court than in this crew of federation leaders who are, of course, among the most well-paid in the Jewish community and oversee a workforce that's 3/4 women.
That's why the Salon is here.
That's right.
We're actually on the Woman on the Map part of the Jewish Women's Archive has this Woman on the Map feature, and we have uploaded the Salon as women who are on the map.
Well, except that in federations, you might need MapQuest to find them.
True enough.
I think that's what's so hard to swallow, because 75% of the federation members are women, and the fact that there hasn't been more of an outcry prior to this, that it just didn't feel right. And I can't minimize the achievement of San Francisco, and just I applaud them, and I hope that it's a sign of what's to come.
So, Cory, you travel around the country. Do women talk about this? Do they care about this? Is it an issue for them?
Oh, certainly it's an issue, but I think there's, in the Jewish community, and I really am sort of the go-to gal for Jewish events in terms of being a comedian. I mean, you name it, I've played there, and no, I'm not joking. And there's sort of this complacency overall that all the Jewish women are kind of running it, but there is a guy that they're bringing coffee to just to make sure that there's a final signature, and it is a little bit odd. But you sort of just get complacent very easily. You sort of accept it. And I think up until now, there's always been this perception that to have a man at the helm put the older generations more at ease, because it's still so unusual for a woman to stand on the bima, and so that there's this mirage that's still
it
held
lags
up
behind the rest of the world. It is amazing. As you were saying that, I was like, really, it's still unusual? And then I was thinking, yeah, it's pretty unusual for a woman to stand on the bima.
And in the context of the world, certainly.
It's just, I mean, it's a crazy thing. It is a crazy. I mean, I grew up, talking about growing up to be a Supreme Court justice. My mom was a lawyer. So when I grew up, my mom, was a working mom in a high-powered job, and I went to law school. It didn't occur to me really, that I would have any barriers. But it was only until I went to law school that I realized sort of how hard it must have been for her to manage what she had to manage, and have done it 30 years earlier than I did it.
I mean, I'll tell you, if I was making my own 100 influential Jews list, I would put the women of the wall on it. And I think that if we don't address some of the disparities that are happening within Judaism, it's much harder to address the ones that are happening outside of Judaism. And I think that it may seem like a small thing, but it's incredibly symbolic when our most holy place has a divide and tells women, you can go over there, but don't pray out loud. And I think that really echoes, that reverberates through the whole community. That gives us a sense of what we're supposed to be.
I love that suggestion. Going to the wall was the least fun experience I had when I visited Israel, for that reason.
And to your point about the list of influential Jews, is the fact that there are more Jews on the Supreme Court than there are in positions of leadership within federation or within large community-based Jewish fundraising. Does that speak to the voice of who's putting them there, or to the women themselves? I haven't actually heard a lot trying to be in these positions of leadership. And in my head, there's also, that constant struggle of home and office and the positions of power and the time it requires, when at the end of the day, there's also no one who's going to do all the other work that we have on us. And that's the blatant biology of it, and that's, I think, such a hindrance.
But I think that's interesting, because so much of the controversy that surrounded Elena Kagan in the first place was, oh, she's not married and doesn't have kids, she must be gay. And so you know, how are you supposed to win? If you choose to take time off, spend it with your family, you get criticized for not working enough, and then if you do well, you're accused of getting special treatment. But then if you decide not to have a family, then you're criticized and people question your sexuality.
And that, I think, goes to the very basics of not only Jewish women, but women all over the world. I mean, that goes to speaks to such a bigger issue that I don't think any of us have been able to find balance for, whether that's in a position of huge power or just trying to balance our everyday lives of getting our kids to school on time and maintaining a sense of self all at the same time, right?
Well, I've been at this a little bit longer than I guess most of you, and while I completely agree that there's still a tremendous amount of work to be done, the difference between now and when I first started having children, my oldest daughter is 26 now, is a huge difference. And so I do think that change is upon us, but you know, we can't be complacent. You're absolutely right, Cory. And I think it's really incumbent upon women in leadership to try to make changes for everybody, not just for women, but for everybody, because you know, in the long run, this liberates men to actually be real human beings also. But if this
not if you ask them. So.
But if this is hard to talk about, I think it's also been really hard to talk about Israel and what's been going on most recently with the flotilla incident, but also just so many of the issues regarding Gaza and the West Bank and Jerusalem. Do you find this same problem where this is almost a subject too hot to discuss?
It's too hot to discuss even right now. I mean, I'll say that. Yeah, you know, like I said, I had visited Israel in October, came back bubbling over with enthusiasm, had a wonderful time. You know, did engage with the issues, but like spoke freely about it. But when the news broke about the flotilla incident, my first instinct was to not say anything and to just like read and find out on all sides what exactly had happened. Mm-hmm. And as I was finding out on all sides what exactly was happening, I saw a certain sentiment bubbling up that made me very uncomfortable. You know, there was a lot of knee-jerk sort of criticism of Israel that, put it this way, I follow Twitter a lot. I do a lot of stuff on Twitter. I saw more discussion and debate and engagement on Israel on the Sunday or the Monday of a long weekend than I had previously seen in its entirety about the flooding of Nashville. That, to me, I found to be significant.
Do you find that it's something that's hard to talk about with friends or with family? We just stay away from it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, I'll give my background, which is that I didn't grow up in a religious family, and I didn't become interested in Judaism until I was an adult. And so there's a lot of, oh, well, you don't understand. Even, you know, I could have been studying Israel for the last 15 years, and there would always be somebody who knows more than I do, somebody who understands the particular situation better than I do. I don't live there, so the people who live there probably know more than I do. So there's always this feeling that no matter how much you read, no matter how much you study, no matter how many sources you consult, you'll never understand well enough, and there will always be someone who invalidates your opinion.
But I think part of it is also the fear of asking questions. I find that is what I get scared about. And that becomes the problem, because if there's no question there are people who know much more about the issue and who I would love to be able to go to and ask questions to and try to understand all sides of the argument. At the same time, I feel a fear of asking if I ask the wrong question, if I ask the wrong person. So how do we educate ourselves and express the wrong reaction? That's absolutely true. So how do we here on this side of the ocean make sure that we're getting as much information as we can from the right sources to form our own opinions and feel comfortable opening up that conversation with the people around us. I know that, you know, I grew up in Canada, as did Rachel, and this is a sort of a gross generalization, and I'm actually curious to hear what you think about it, but I grew up as a Jew first and then as a Canadian in a lot of ways, and I find in the States, people grew up as an American first and then as a Jew. And I know so many Jews who are far more assimilated than me, in that they're a Jew by birth, but sort of that's it, and they haven't chosen to practice at all. And so engaging with them in the conversation of Israel becomes difficult.
I think that my experience coming here was, you know, there's a little bit more taken for granted, I think, because being Jewish in the States is, especially in New York, like, it's a pretty normal thing. I remember my first week seeing a Moishe's moving van go down the street, and I was like, really? It's not at Bathurst and Eglinton, which is like the Jewish area in Toronto. And so because of that freedom, right, because of that assimilation, there's more of a freedom to take it or leave it. And I think that, that the Peter Beinart essay that people are talking a lot about in the New York Review of Books recently addresses that, which is that, Jewish youth are growing up here in the States less sort of dogmatically dedicated to Israel and, less attached to it, and then a lot more critical of it, a lot more questioning of it.
Well, I think if your orientation, first and foremost, is growing up as a liberal Democrat, which a lot of the Jewish population in New York City is.
Majority of the Jewish population in America
is. You can't help but be so aware of human rights issues all over the world. And so when you start to hear trickling in of information where human rights are really being compromised, it puts you, as a Jew, in a very, very awkward situation.
As a human.
Because I do get the sense that when you question and when you publicly debate it, if you ask too many questions or you show too much concern, then you are therefore anti-Israel. And so I feel very uncomfortable talking about it. When I saw this on the list, I was like, oh, yeah, and they want me to make jokes? Okay, well, I think that that the boats had a wonderful buffet. I mean, I don't know,
No, I mean, but you raise like that's it, right? Like, how do you engage with, and I think one of the problems is that it used to be such a clear moral high ground. Israel existed because of the Holocaust, because Jews needed a place that was safe. And when the sort of oppressed become perceived as the oppressor, there is a shift in moral high ground, and these are not clear cut. There were abuses that clearly happened on the ships, but it was trying to run a blockade that exists for a clear reason, because Hamas really enjoys lobbing rockets into Israel. So it's a chicken egg thing that just keeps on going, and it's hard.
But here's where I think women really have to exert some leadership in the conversation. Much of the conversation about this is still dominated by men. It's stunning to me if you looked at the blogosphere, if you looked at all the columnists. And yes, you can blame the Israeli government, or you can blame AIPAC or J Street or whatever it is, but a lot of this starts with how we're raising our children, what kind of conversation we want to have at home. You talked about asking questions. We ought to welcome that. I mean, what is more Jewish than to ask questions?
Right.
And
hopefully around a table with some bacon on the
and Manischewitz.
Yeah.
No, actually, if there's one thing I can say that Israel's doing really well right now is making kosher wine. There is excellent wine coming out of Israel.
Great.
Thank God. But you're absolutely right, Jane. And I think that you're absolutely right that it starts at the beginning, and it starts with women, because we, at the end of the day, are still the ones doing the majority of the housework and a majority of the raising of our children, and so I agree that there needs to be, from the beginning, an open forum on who we are as Jews, who we are as members of our community, and making sure that as women, as children, as human beings, that we can feel comfortable asking those questions and discussing it openly, if not with our families, then with who else?
I feel better now. That was a little bit like Jewish
so now
therapy.
we'll tackle something really difficult.
Oh, okay.
Burqas in France. The French Parliament is considering...
We are just going for it today.
I know, we are. The French Parliament is considering banning women from wearing the burqas. Nicolas Sarkozy, the French president, is in favor of such a ban. He says the issue of the burqa is not a religious issue. It is a question of freedom and women's dignity. Is this an issue about women's liberation, or is it a sign of religious oppression?
Well, it's interesting, because as a Jewish woman, as a feminist, there's a part of me that's like, yeah. But as a Democrat and believing in human rights, I would not be able to sign the petition to ban a burqa, because if a woman wants to wear this, she should not be denied that right. Yeah. That said,
it's hard to tell and hard to know if they want to wear it or if they're
Sarkozy
being.
know that?
Huh?
You know, how does he know that? How is he inside the religious homes of these families? Like, it's, you know, I'd be a lot more comfortable with it if France was not itself a dicey hotbed of intolerance. And this, it smacks of intolerance. Like,
A dicey hotbed of
inside the
intolerance,
culture,
but also
I'm not a fan of like imposing the burqa, but inside the greater culture, I'm not a fan of saying, you know, you can't wear the burqa, because it sounds a lot to me like like that kippah makes me feel uncomfortable. You know, like, what are you doing wearing that
It could be,
tallis?
but you know, in a certain way, you could argue that France is ahead of everyone else. It does have the largest population of Muslims in Europe, and so to some degree, they are on the cutting edge of dealing with an issue that
And we are
actually
talking
maybe
about a very small, at the end of the day, the amount of women who are wearing burqas in France is a tiny, tiny population. So it's much more a statement than a practical application in some ways. You know,
But who gets to make that determination?
I agree with you. And
that's where I'm uncomfortable with it.
But you know, because it's France and I get to be the observer, should that happen, I would love to see if it opened up possibilities for Muslim women. Like, I'd love for it to be a controlled, you know, experiment that I could just observe. You know,
What do you mean by possibilities?
if it was a ban and women had to live more secularly, if they would seize on opportunities and feel more empowered. I don't know. It would be interesting to just sort of watch it from a distance, whereas I'd be obviously opposed to it in the United States. I feel like I'm copping out by saying that, because there is, as a feminist, I really, really have a hard time with it.
Yeah,
Especially when you've read about, you know, that the burqa also conceals wounds and you know, proof of abuses and that kind of thing.
Right.
well, that's
and
the
the whole
piece we'll never know.
And that's the whole sense that women need to be invisible, have no character or personality or face in public, is very,
And the
very
message
oppressive.
it sends to men who see it, who are not necessarily Muslim men, continues to sort of send that message that, you know, in certain ways of thinking, in certain cultures, you are less than. And I just hate that message out there.
Yeah, and I also hate this notion of the woman has to cover up in case the man looks at her and he feels tempted. And I don't think that's by any means something that only Muslim culture has ever had. But this notion of, you know, this notion of it's the woman's fault for the man looking at her, I think, you know, I'm a feminist as well, and I think that a big part of feminism is also working with men. I don't think it's only about encouraging women. I think it's about all members of society. And you know, that's why I go back and forth on this, is I don't know if it's to protect them or if it's to continue hiding them.
Well, and if I can say, this is bold to say, in many pieces of Jewish religion, 4 of the 5 of us wouldn't be allowed to be sitting the way we're sitting right now, with our knees showing and with our arms showing. So how do we? Well, that's just and I'm going there, and I can't believe I'm going there. But it's
Hey,
very.
I'm single, I don't have to cover my
But there's, you're absolutely right. But there's degrees, and where do you draw that line?
Sure,
and where
that's
can
the
you
hard
say
part.
what's
Who
the
decides
difference?
it?
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer. And it is a
None of us do.
hot topic, but it's, you know,
Cory
it's
does.
a very slippery slope. Again, it's a very careful line that's
Gail,
being
we
drawn.
are the future.
Yes, I believe the children are our future at the same time.
Okay, we've had enough discussion about really, really difficult topics. So it's summertime. Gone to any good weddings lately, Rachel?
I know. See, the funny thing is, you're like, we've had enough discussion about these difficult topics, so let's ask the unmarried Jewish woman. No, I have. Let me think. I haven't been to. Oh, I have. I did go to a great wedding. I went to my friend Russell's wedding, to a lovely doctor, a nice lawyer, and a nice doctor in Toronto. So much nachas. But yeah, it's what a transition. My goodness.
What are the trends that are happening now in weddings?
I have a good Jewish wedding story. I'm going to my other Jewish friend from North Carolina. We were the only 2. I'm going to
North
her wedding.
Carolina?
I am.
Fantastic.
So next month, I'm going to her wedding, and she's originally from Raleigh, as am I. But her fiance's family is much more religious than she is, and they want a Glatt kosher caterer, which we don't have. There's not one in North Carolina. So the whole wedding is going to be vegetarian, and it's become this huge thing. Like, they don't even want to eat the vegetables at the wedding. And she was like, great, you're welcome to freeze dry whatever you'd like to bring with you. But it is sort of interesting, because for them it's the first time they're learning about Jewish cultures outside of New York City. And
We
seeing
take a lot for granted.
Yes.
What's interesting is that every conversation that we've had thus far today has been about adapting, compromising, you know,
Big
figuring out where we
every step of the way, you know?
We can't just relax and like say mazel tov. It's got to be a problem. That is.
The world is not in a Mazel Tov sort of place right now, if we may say.
Well, I think that there still should be some time for unbridled celebration. I know we have a family wedding next month, and I'm really looking forward to it.
That's a good pun. Unbridled.
No, that's just me. I'm just kidding. Anyhow, I think we've pretty much run the emotional gamut today on the Salon. But one more. We actually have a wonderful unbridled note to end on. We have to send a big mazel tov out. We've got one more potential viewer for the Salon. Jewish Channel CEO Ellie Singer just welcomed a baby girl. So congratulations.
That's right. And we are big fans of girls here. So thank you so much for joining us for another wonderful discussion. My thanks again to Gail Simmons and to Cory Kahaney and to Lilit Marcus and of course to you, Rachel. I'm Jane Eisner, editor of The Forward. Please check out our conversation at forward.com on our Sisterhood blog. For everyone here at the Salon, thank you and join us again.